Imagine a place where the boundaries of age, industry, background, and culture melt away, replaced by a shared desire to explore the depths of our collective experiences here on the open, shaded porch. Amidst an atmosphere of serenity and tranquility, leaders from all walks of life gather to share their stories, the stories that shape their very beings and doings. This is the Knowledge Mindfulness Porch with Laila Maroof.
Joining me on the porch is Richard Cytowic, a pioneering neurologist and a professor of neurology at George Washington University, renowned for his groundbreaking research on synesthesia. He's the author of several influential books, and in his latest work, Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age, he explores the profound impact of digital technology on our prehistoric brains, offering insights into how we can cope with digital distraction and sensory overload in the modern world. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here with us today. I'm really honored for taking the time to really share many of your great research findings and insights. And I'm so excited to learn more about the human brain. I never thought I would really be so curious till I read your book, your latest book. And it was just like, wow, mind-boggling, as they say.
You have become enlightened.
Yes, in many ways, definitely, in many ways. But allow me, please, first to go back in time to 2013. And that's when President Barack Obama announced about the BRAIN Initiative, a very large-scale, innovative initiative that kind of aimed at more investment in advancing neurotechnologies at that time. And those advancements were really aimed also in understanding more about the human brain. And now fast forward to 2024, and the Nobel Prize in Physics goes to John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton. For what? For their foundational discoveries and inventions that enabled machine learning with artificial neural networks. I mean, in 10 years, that is crazy. That is crazy. They knew so much about the human brain, and look what that understanding really kind of where we are now because of that deep understanding. But I think all this advancement is great. It's amazing. It really does good in the world in terms of treating diseases, Alzheimer's, autism, and all that. But again, there's always this yet. Yet, there's always another side to those technologies. And I think that's what your latest book, Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age, is really addressing. And what really caught my attention in the title again is your terminology, Stone Age Brain. I'm very curious to know, is this literally true or it is just shockingly true?
No, it's really true. The modern brain is no different from that of our very distant ancestor. iPhones and technology has advanced, exponentially, whereas the brain doesn't change at that fast of a pace. So no, we do have a Stone Age brain, and it has certain limitations to it. One of which I think will really surprise your listeners is that the brain has a fixed bandwidth of energy available to it. So no amount of diet, exercise, Sudoku puzzles, a pot of coffee is going to change that at all. So we have to work with the limits that we have. And I think this is one of the reasons that people get so their attention span has just gone to hell, is that they're being constantly demanded by these devices to look at me, scroll through the screen. Here comes another push notification. Here's a text message, etc. And we can't keep up with that pace.
I'm surprised. You're talking about something we hear all the time about the short attention span, especially with younger generations. And we hear that all the time. We read about it all the time. But when it comes to brain energy, We rarely hear about that, and really how much.
Only if you're an engineer or a neurologist like me, who's always thinking in terms of this. See, the problem is that people are looking at digital distractions and their fragmented attention spans through the point of view of the technology itself, and that's the error. You want to look at it from the brain's point of view. What, and again, very few people think of how they think, the way that they think, and what is the energy cost of doing certain things, of memory, of speech, of action. And for example, we're having a conversation, and it's using up about half of our bandwidth already, which is why trying to follow two people speaking at the same time is pretty much impossible. It's just exceeded our capacity.
What I hear you saying is that we have a finite energy that we need to be efficient about. So how can we do that?
One is to not pile on so much. You talk about being mindful. Let me backtrack a little bit. The brain is an energy hog. It uses 20% of our daily calories that we burn, but it only counts for 2% of the body's mass. And so most of that energy goes towards maintaining the physical structure by pumping sodium and potassium ions across membrane. So there's very little that's left over for mental thought. And that's why we strain to come up against these boundaries. And the worst thing that we can do is to shift our focus from one thing to another, from A to B, back to A, then over to C, and then back to A. That is the most energy draining thing that we can possibly do, which is what multitasking is really. And we literally don't multitask. We shuttle between things. And this is very costly in terms of energy. And this is why it's so fatiguing to try to do this.
But aren't we living in a world that we're bombarded all the time with distractions around us? I mean, it's just never ending, right?
Well, there have been distractions in the past. The example I use is in medicine, that on rounds, there's a famous case where a resident got a text message about a party coming up. And while that was happening, she neglected to enter an order for a change in medication, and the child nearly died. So in my father's generation, and in my generation, we were distracted all the time, but they didn't cause us to make mistakes. And I think probably part of the thing is that your screen device, your tablet or your phone, uses up your working memory, and your working memory cannot do two things at once. This was illustrated by the famous Oscar fiasco, in which they announced the wrong Best Picture. And why? Because Andrew Cullinan from Pricewaterhouse on one side of the stage was tweeting about Emma Stone at the exact moment he should have been discarding the envelope he had in queuing up the next one. So he exhausted his working memory, and that's why he reached for the wrong envelope, and everybody went, hysterical about it.
Wow, what a story, right?
So the screen is much different in terms of it's really occupying our working memory, because it's not something passive that we're working with, and the devices aren't speaking with us like another person would. They're basically talking at us. The screens are brilliant technology in horrific psychology, because they do what's known as a positive intermittent reinforcement. So the scrolling of the screen, you keep scrolling and scrolling. There's no end in sight. When do you stop? You don't have no cues to stop. And certainly young people don't have very much self-control, so they're even worse at it than you and I might be. So it's like a slot machine. You put in money and you pull the lever, and after a couple cycles, you get a small win. So you keep playing, and then you get a bigger win, and then finally you might get anything close to the jackpot. And so it keeps pushing you the rewards that come only some of the time are much stronger in terms of psychology than, let's say, Pavlov's dog is at classical conditioning. So if you don't get a reward every time you swipe, but you get it sometimes, you're going to keep swiping.
So it's really an addictive behavior we're talking about here. It's addiction, right? Kind of like addiction.
It is a behavioral addiction, just as pornography and sex and shopping and gambling are all behavioral addictions. We're very familiar with the physical addictions of alcohol and cocaine, for example, but people are less familiar with the behavioral addictions. And, the phone in your hand is a great temptation. It's the great Satan, we might say, that is determined to spoil your peace of mind.
I don't know, but I just feel it's like the smartphone, or even the watch now, the smartwatch, and now recently the smart glasses, is just all devices that are getting closer and closer and closer to us all the time. And I feel that this is kind of a more complex situation than the distractions you were talking about without the devices. Because when you talk about screen, I think also about the overload of information that's coming within those screen at, different times. It's all the time with me in the bedroom, with us in the restaurants, with us as a family. So the complexity of all this is just huge, right?
But the solution is simple: turn it off, or put it face down. Put it in the next room for an hour and go take a walk. Do something physical, and for your peace of mind. So when we talk about mindfulness, it's, are you being attentive about how you're using your devices? Are you setting certain periods of the day when you'll check? I'll check my email early in the morning, like at 5 a.m., and again in the late afternoon, and that's it. And if you want to reach me, you can't. I'm not available. And that's a really liberating thing, to be unavailable. When I was a resident, we had beepers that we wore on our belt, and what a status symbol that was, because that meant, look, I'm important. I have to be reachable at any moment. Well, fast forward in today, to be unreachable is the great luxury.
True, very, very true. But I think that goes back to our knowledge maturity. I know you've been using the word mindfulness, but I think the focus is, I coined the term knowledge mindfulness, which is really about deeper understanding of what's going on in the context that you're living in, that you're kind of sensory. When you talk about sensory stimulation, how much you're aware of your context, your situation, and how do you relate that so much to what you're feeling, what's your needs, and putting that together in a harmony, in a cohesive manner.
You can't have self-reflection if you're so busy and overstimulated all the time. I mean, it's really remarkable. People obsess over what they put in their bodies. Vegan, non-GMO, no artificial coloring, etc. And yet they don't give a second's thought to the mental garbage that they consume. And of course, that's much more harmful than the occasional cheeseburger. So I would caution people to think, what's your mental diet? Start with that. How am I spending my day? What am I taking in through my senses?
Very true, very, very true. But that also comes from awareness, from understanding all this that you're talking about. Sometimes I find it difficult to bridge the gap between all the research that is going on one side with their conclusion, and then how do you simplify that and transfer and share that knowledge in a simple way for the public to understand it and benefit from it. And I think this is a bridge that we need to make it stronger and shorter, for the knowledge to flow easier between the two. because I think it's lack of understanding of all this. And sometimes it's a choice of we don't want to know. And as you rightfully said, I mean, even this would really affect generations to come now in terms of their education when it comes to their learnings. Because
Oh, it already has. Yeah. Young people can't carry on. They can't carry on a conversation. They don't know how to make small talk. They're terrified of doorbells and ringing telephones because they're so used to having a text that says, "I'm here outside." Um, they're what this intermediation of these screen devices has displaced one-on-one in-person contact. And so if you're not used to looking somebody in the eye and reading their body language and their facial expression, then you're going to be very bad at making conversation with people. You'll be terrified at it because you're so poor at it.
But that is really striking that I think we're not kind of solving all that in many ways, in the deeper ways that it needs to be solved.
It would help that if parents model better behavior, but they're just as bad as the kids are. And this has been shown by multiple research of where, the mother can't put down her phone and the child is sort of, begging for attention and not getting any. The famous still face experiment showed this, where it used to be that if mommy was on the phone in the past, well, the phone was either bolted to the wall or sitting on the counter, and she could look at you and hold up a finger and say, "Just a minute, I'll be with you in a minute." Okay, but when she's on her phone, she's fixated on that screen, and she doesn't see the child making bids for attention. And so the child eventually just gives up and realizes that, mommy's not going to pay attention to me. I'm not important. And that really affects self-esteem. We talked about schooling. It's already affected the way children learn, their memory, their capacity to retain things. Not good. And even my medical students, they all have iPads and laptops and all that. And I tell them, you're going to take notes, take them by hand on a pad in your own handwriting. And of course, most people, they can't write anymore because they don't teach cursive anymore. So, and why is that? Well, because there's a connection between the brain and the hand, which is why people's signatures are completely unique to them. You could recognize them in a moment. I could recognize my grandmother's handwriting. I can recognize a lot of people's handwriting because it looks the same all the time, and it's there. It is their signature, literally. And three fingers may do the writing, but the entire brain is engaged in this action. So that's a kind of physical activity that would be very helpful for young people to do, as would going to play outside without a device. Use your own imagination, invent games, and make up your own rules. Play with sticks and stones and mud by the lake. Help each other. That's part of socialization. And one of the really awful things about the pandemic, and I saw this, we've got, I don't know, dozens of kids in our neighborhood. In the back alley, I see them walking and with their dogs so often. And during the pandemic, I said to the parents, I said, boy, I'm really worried that they're not in school because they're missing out on all the socialization that 3, 4, and 5-year-olds get when they're with other children in that sort of formal school setting. And I think, the evidence is very clear that kids lost an awful lot of social skills and intellectual skills during the pandemic because they were so isolated socially.
Yeah. Let me go back to your example about how parents should model behavior. It just reminded me of the old days when people used to smoke cigarettes. It was a normal thing. And the mom and dad, how can they tell the kids don't smoke when they're smoking themselves? And just it brought something to my mind about why can't we do the same thing when it comes to technology and screen and all that, showing something we link kind of all the, bad stuff about screens and times on, tech all the time. One thing could be maybe emphasizing what you mentioned in your book about virtual autism and how the symptoms, if we can enhance that and make parents feel, oh my God, I don't want my kids to be having that.
I mean, parents see this. They say it's turning my kid into a zombie, and that's actually true. What heavy screen exposure does for people of all age, but particularly young people, is induce what I call virtual autism, which is the appearance of autistic-like symptoms due to heavy screen use. And this is, first of all, reduced eye contact, reduce verbal engagement. You're lucky to get a grunt out of them. You call their name, they don't respond. You ask them a question, nothing. Maybe you get a. I remember being at a surprise birthday party for my older nephew, and one of his coworkers had a young kid there who had some sort of game thing, and with a battery pack extension, which showed you that how much he was using this thing. And the kid was simply heads down, glued to the screen. And the mother says, "Ian, say hello to Dr. Cytowic." And he, looking at them, and just, I did. I was like, oh my God. And, you try to talk to the parents and they say, you try to take the devices away and the kid has a meltdown. They throw a tantrum. And that's what you have to do, unfortunately. With virtual autism, which was first described by a bunch of Romanian psychiatrists in an orphanage where these kids had been really neglected, is that those that had heavy screen exposure were showing signs of autism, even though they didn't have developmental autism. And once they took the screens away, the phones, the tablets, the TVs, the symptoms reversed themselves, which, of course, they never do in genuine autism. And this has been shown over and over again with programs like Restart, which is a digital detoxification program for young people, is that when you put them in this camp with other kids and there's no TV, there's no tab, there's no screens of any kind, they have to actually talk to one another and talk to the counselors and engage in exercises, etc., and physical exercise as well, is that their symptoms slowly revert. And it doesn't take long for this to happen, just a couple of weeks.
That's what I'm saying. That's nuts. I mean, really.
But parents aren't aware of this. And
yes.
Listen, let's face it, that the tech industry is much better at distracting us than our poor brains are at protecting ourselves against their efforts to distract us. It's like David and Goliath, and we don't even have a slingshot. It's really an imbalance between these two forces. One, because there's a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of arrogance involved. Sometimes there are people had the light goes off. One father was involved in a company that made games and stuff that are so-called educational games. And so the company gave him one and he gave it to his daughter, and he was going to go work for them in Europe. And after 1 month, he saw what it did to his daughter and said all she got better at was learning how to play these games. There's no crossover effect. So that if you learn how to be better on your screen, you don't learn more vocabulary. You don't learn how to make longer sentences. You don't learn how to lay down a complex argument, let alone a coherent thought. So this is the problem with this technology, is that it doesn't cross over into general intelligence. And that's the disappointing thing. And the other thing is that, of course, they're very cool. I mean, let's face it, they are fun and handy and all that. I remember for many, many years, my husband and I just had track phones to make the occasional outgoing call, because, like, who are we going to call? Who's going to call us? Nobody. And we were in New York once looking for an address. Now, this is a city set up on a grid, for goodness sake, and we couldn't find this place. And so in exasperation, we turned to one another and said, we have got to get an iPhone, if only for the maps. And once we got one, we each got an iPhone, and I played with it for a day or two. I said, oh my God, I see why these things are so addictive. There it was, but I could see that because of my profession.
Because you know.
in neurology and as a neuropsychologist and the thinking about thinking and how the brain works all the time. So naturally, this is going to be obvious to me. But for a person that just thinks in terms of technology per se without thinking, how is my brain interacting with this? It's going to pass them right by. So that goes for parents as well as kids. Gradually, parents are becoming better educated about this. And ironically, it's the parents in Silicon Valley who invented all this stuff. And they forbid their children to have these devices. They have their nannies sign non-disclosure agreements that they will not use their phones in front of their kids or they'll be fired. And I mean, what hypocrisy that, so what do they know that they're not telling everybody else? And what if your phone came with a release from liability agreement that you had to agree that you were going to hold the company harmless for any danger that affected your children? Companies would freak out at that. They don't want to be on the hook for this kind of liability.
So why don't we have policies like that?
Because we're not clever enough to enact them. It would be good to make them accountable. This has been the history of technology. They put out what's called bloatware or vaporware. So a program comes out and it's full of bugs, and so they have to make a patch, and you have to update your program in over and over and over again. It's never perfect. It's never good enough. So, and consumers have never held any technology company, whether it's Microsoft or Meta, they've never held them responsible for all the grief that they've put their users through. I mean, I imagine I've spent a month of my lifetime upgrading software. Why should I have to do that? Why can't the software be good enough as it is?
Yes, and that's the least of our problems when it comes to shallow gulps of information streams, as you said, and how it's affecting kids in their reading ability, their writing ability. All that is really alarming for the generations to come. Generation Alpha, Beta. I mean, what is their knowledge maturity is going to be like?
I'm glad I won't be hiring anybody in the future. I mean, Mike, I'm retired from medicine, so I don't have to worry about that. But I think, who's going to hire these kids? They can't think, cannot think.
And I think this is also the biggest problem facing these generations, because they're competing now with what? With algorithms, with robots, where, as you mentioned in the book, about the brain circuit and how slow it is compared with the electronic circuit. So how do you see the future for those kids with the lower, as we said, knowledge maturity, and all the skills needed for today's world are not there, and then they're competing with augmented knowledge, with that fast, immediate.
I know if you're using ChatGPT to do your homework, you're not learning anything. I remember my favorite teacher in high school was Mr. Bamman, the physics teacher. Oh God, he gave us so much homework to do. And I would be sitting at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a graph paper and a slide rule doing these physics problems and all that. And, I look back on him as thank God he made us do that. He wasn't being mean. He wasn't being difficult. He knew that we could do the work, and he knew that if we did the work, we would learn something. And I am so glad to be able to look back and think, boy, I'm glad I learned what I did. I'm glad, this is a cliche, but, I love being in school. So I went back in my 50s to get my MFA in creative writing. And it was the best thing I'd done in 20 years, to be around all these creative people, to go wander the library, the stacks, just see what books there were serendipitously. It's like, it's like I'm in a candy store. But I think that's an unusual attitude. People they want things fast and easy. They don't want to have to work to learn anything. And this is what there's a wonderful book called The Revenge of Analog, which talks about Moleskine notebooks, sketching in them vinyl records where you can hear the scratch of the record and the needle drop and all that. And of course, reading books. And people talk about the pleasure of the readability of finishing a novel or even a nonfiction work, a long, linear kind of argument. And Thomas Styron said, when you reach the end of a book, there's this sense of relief that you've been through something, and there's like this release that goes on, and it's a very positive kind of feedback that you get from doing that. Plus, it builds your resilience. Is that when you do something difficult like that, then you say, "Oh, look what I did! I can get through this." So when it happens again, it's like, "Oh, I this is familiar. I know how to do this." Yeah.
Yeah, your ability to recall it.
And your confidence level. Yeah. Oh, people talk about connecting the dots. Well, if you don't have any dots to connect, then, and where do you get dots? You get dots from general knowledge, by reading far and wide, doing all sorts of physical things. You don't get it from staring at a screen.
Exactly. In knowledge mindfulness, we view those dots as pieces of information. We then process and synthesize these high-quality bits of information that come in through our 5 senses and directly through our intuition. It's a combination of both. I'd love to take a deep dive into one of your specialties, synesthesia. However, that will have to wait until next week. Also coming up in part 2, neurologist Richard Cytowic will share some strategies for disconnecting from technology.
When we're at our computers or our phones and all that, stand up and take a break for 20 seconds. Look out the window, what the Dutch call niksen. Doing nothing for a few moments is plenty to just sort of recharge. It's like letting up on the clutch or hitting the brakes. You're going to just sort of stop this race car going downhill for a moment so you can catch your breath, and then you can move on.
You have been listening to the Knowledge Mindfulness Porch with Laila Maroof. If you want to join the movement of knowledge mindfulness and shape the world of tomorrow, go to drlailamaroof.com. The Knowledge Mindfulness Porch is a production of Forbes Books.